Hi, this is Misha, and this is a companion video to R1 that's basically why you should buy an imported AK over a US-made AK. So with that, we'd talk about the import history of Kalashnikov AK type rifles that have come into this country. The very first AK to come into the United States was the Finnish Valmet M62S. I know this doesn't look much like an AK, that's because of the furniture. And we have history videos on all these, so I'm not going into history except for the import aspect. This was it's built on a milled receiver. It's based on the Russian AK-47 Type 3, but we have very unique furniture, a different style of gas tube, but it's an AK, and it fires 7.62x39 and feeds from AK magazines. They started to import these, no one knows exactly when, but around 1966, 1967. It was right around the time of the Gun Control Act, which was passed. Now, the Gun Control Act had a lot to it, but the part for our purposes we care about, it restricted a few things, such as grenade launchers, woohoo, and it also required import marks. So the earliest guns coming in from Finland, made by Valmet, were marked inner arms. They were the initial importer. They would bring about 200 of this pattern in, and it didn't sell at all. A few reasons. The 7.62 cartridge was expensive and quite rare in America at the time. And the furniture was a turnoff. They used the same, this is basically the exact same gun as the Finnish military was using, but in semi-auto. American shooters of the day were not very interested. So after only 200 or so of these were brought in, they would bring in another version with a more traditional wood stock and pistol grip, although they would retain this handguard. It would sell modestly better, but by 1972-73, it was pretty much out of import. They were still selling off old stock as late as 1975-76. They would bring about 1,000 of the wood-stocked M62s in. They were extremely high-quality guns, but just not what America wanted. They have flash hider, bayonet lug, all the features. In 1972, they introduced the M71, which was a more traditional AKM look, and it was in 223. They were trying to appeal to the American market. But it had some issues, cracking stocks, the polymer wasn't great, and it used proprietary mags. It didn't really sell much better. So in 1976, they introduced the M76 series, and that's really the Valmet series that took off. They would do it in 3 calibers, 223, 5.56 NATO, 308, 7.62 NATO, which was the most popular, and a few in 7.62x39 just to keep up appearances, but very few. We're talking, 150 fixed stock and maybe 50 folders. The original M76s would have a stamped receiver, as would the M71s before them, but the M76 receiver would be reinforced and better. Later, though, in the 80s, they would go back to a milled receiver, similar to this, except no lightning cuts. So it was a simplified, basically a slab side milled receiver. And they would do a few different versions. They would do fixed wood stocks, they would do fixed tube stocks, they would do folding tube stocks, so on and so forth. Now, after that, they would introduce the M78, which was an RPK version. It had a heavier, longer barrel with attached bipod. They would mostly sell those in 7.62 NATO, with a few in 223 and 7.62x39. And the final major version was the M82, which was a bullpup, and it was imported in 5.56. The Finnish military did try out the M82, but found it unacceptable. I think mostly it was the paratroopers that tried it out. So quite a few guns came in, You know, off the top of my head, I can't remember the number total, but it was a relatively small number, though. It was under 10,000. I'm wanting to say around 8,000 came in total, including all versions. Either way, small. Today, the 223 wood-stocked M76 is the most common. And if you're talking least common, there are some unicorns out there. For example, the M76 in 76239 with the folding tube stock is extremely rare. The 308 M76 with the folding stock is also quite rare. In 1986, Valmet would sell off its firearms division, and the last guns would come into the country a short time later, and they'd still be selling off old stock until the late 80s, early 90s. It's worth noting that none of the Saiga guns ever came in. Saiga did a semi-automatic version of the RK95 as the M92S, but it wasn't allowed in. Moving on, probably the most famous of the so-called preban guns were the Chinese. There were a myriad of importers and multiple versions, especially early on. The first Chinese guns appeared around 1983, and they were imported by Clayco. These would be a little different. They would be more of an AKM style, and they would have polymer, Bakelite, fiberglass type furniture, either black or red. But as soon as Clayco started bringing them in, the gates opened up. Many importers would get on the game. 1984, B West would. This gun here is an 84-85 B West import. Then you would have Polytech and Norinco get set up, and it would just go on from there. There's a huge list of different importers and things. And they offered these mostly in 7.62x39, with the smaller number in 223-556, known as the Type 84, and a very small number in 5.45x39, known as the Type 88. In fact, the Type 88 is kind of interesting for being the first rifle, semi-auto rifle in that caliber to ever be sold in the US, but they only imported about 50, maybe 100 at most, so extremely rare today. So most, though, were in 7.62x39. Originally, they would be known as the AKS, but then the name would change to Type 56 or just 56S for the standard model, 56S-1 for the underfolder, 56S-2 for the side-folding Bakelite version. The 56S-5 was a match grade gun, and so on and so forth. There would, of course, also be the Polytech Legend of fame. This gun here, this V West AKS, is built on a 1.5 mil receiver. The Polytech Legend would be built on a milled receiver, and they would do a pretty good job of replicating an original Russian AK-47 Type 3, but they would have a few differences that would be held over from their production style because they weren't making those for military, they were making them for the US market. For example, the Legend has the 2-rivet trigger guard versus the 4. Little changes like that. It also has a pressed and pinned barrel versus the screw-in. But yeah, China sent over a lot during the 80s. Really, the Chinese AK is the ubiquitous pre-ban AK, with the Polytechs generally considered the most desirable. I like this version as it has the spiker. I just thought it was to me, this is the quintessential Chinese AK. It's different. It shows their own engineering. Now, these guns are all foreign built and imported, as you see. They have no US parts. The only change they had to make was to add an import mark. This is a Hungarian SA-85M, imported by Kastner and built by FEG. This was another relatively early import. In 1986, Kastner would bring 7,000 of these over. 3,000 were of the fixed-stocked variety, and 4,000 were the underfolding type, as you see here. Now, this rifle is quite close to a Soviet pattern AKM, but it has differences because it's not based on that. It's based on the Hungarian AK-63. This one's based on the AK-63D. The fixed stock would be the AK-63F. In recent years, AK-63D part skits have hit the country, so you can see those. There's a few minor differences. We have the ported gas tube carried over from the AK-47. We have kind of larger slab-side handguards carried over from the AK-47. We have a non-lightning cut bolt carrier, wooden pistol grip, of course. And does this one have a double hook? No, it's a single hook trigger. This one also still has a bayonet lug. It has a threaded muzzle. It did come with the slant type compensator. Leather sling. But yeah, a batch of 7,000 was imported in '86 and was sold through the late '80s. Good, solid guns. Now I'm going to cheat here a little bit and talk about Egyptian guns, prebans, and not hold that preban. Sorry. In 1982, Steyr would import what could arguably be the first true clone of a Soviet-Russian AKM. These would come out of Egypt. They were built at the Maadi factory, Factory 54, which was set up and originally supervised by the Russians. So they copied the Russians down to the paint finish, the laminated furniture, so on and so forth. They would bring over between 2,000 and 2,500 of these in 1982, and that was it. The reason they didn't bring more, it was a flop. It was very expensive. Looking at the Chinese gun and the Hungarian, they were priced pretty reasonably. $250, $300, $350. The Maadi guns imported by Steyr were more like the Valmets. They were priced upwards of $1,000. I believe these were about $800, $700, $800 at the day. They did come with several accessories, but you know, still, it's more than twice. And you just got some extra mags and stuff like that and a bayonet. And a lot of the Chinese guns came with the same stuff. So while they were earlier to market than the Chinese and the Hungarian, they mostly sat in warehouses and store shelves. People didn't want to buy the Egyptian Maadis. So only the few thousand that Steyr imported. Also in 1986, another company called Interport imported a very small number of Egyptian Maadis with side folding stocks, kind of the wire poker style. They have their own unique one. It flares out at the back. It's kind of neat. It's based on the German. Those are pretty much your pre-ban 1980s and before AK imports. Those are the only countries importing at that time. Relations with Russia, Soviet Russia still then, weren't good enough. Not much out of Poland at all. Romania wasn't doing anything yet. Except, and I'm going to cheat again here, for Mitchell Arms. They imported a small number of guns from Yugoslavia. It was still in Yugoslavia, manufactured by Zastava. They started to import them in 1988, and that's the problem. They're able to get about 2,000 over. They would be called the M70. It would basically be like this rifle here. It would be very similar to the military's M70B1, but it would lack, even in the 80s, the grenade sights and the bayonet lug. So it was kind of already a sporterized version. They would also do a version of the M72 RPK. They would do a version of the M76 in 8mm. They would do a version of the M77B1 and 7.62 NATO 308. And they would even do a version of the RPK, the M72 and 7.62 NATO 308. Pretty extensive line. Shame it didn't last long. The guns had a very nice blued finish. They had polished bolt carriers. Zastava was really trying to impress. They put a lot of effort into them. They would also do a underfolder version similar to the M70 AB2. But then 1989 happened. President Bush signed an executive order adding several guns by name to the 1968 Gun Control Act, banning them outright from import. He also said if a gun had two or more of the features, it was considered an assault weapon, assault rifle. The features included detachable magazine, pistol grip, threaded barrel, flash hider, bayonet lug, folding stock, and so on and so forth. In response, companies started importing guns with thumbhole stocks from 1990 onward. And they would basically be the exact same guns coming in, except they wouldn't have the pistol grip and stock. They would have just a thumbhole wood stock, usually sometimes polymer. They would not have a threaded barrel, or the threads would have a cap permanently welded over them. And of course, bayonet lugs and folding stocks were gone. Okay, so with Valmet, we had none. There's no post-1989 ban Valmets, because Valmet was no longer making guns even before that. With Hungarian guns, Kastner would go away and be replaced by KBI as the importer, and they would import the same SA 85M gun from 1990 till 1998. It would be the same as this, except no stock, thumbhole, like I said, no bayonet lug. Same good quality, just had a goofy sporter stock. It would even, and these guns would still all take normal AK magazines. However, in 1998, wanting to get in on the fun, Bill Clinton signed another executive order adding 30 more guns by name to the 1968 and the 1989 bans, and it was decided that the ability to feed from a high-capacity magazine was not okay. So guns like the post-ban SA-85M were no longer legal after 1998. In response to that, KBI and FEG would do the SA-2000M, which was a polymer-stocked version with a single-stack 10-round magwell. And those would be imported briefly until about 2001, 2002. Now, China wasn't going to let a small thing like the 89 ban get in their way. So in 1990, they introduced the MAC 90, and they would do a few different versions of it. Most would have the stamped receiver, but some would be on the milled, especially in 93. There was a large batch of milled MAC 90s that came in 93. Thumbhole stock again. Threads were turned off the barrels. Bayonet lug was gone. Most of you know the MAC 90. And they imported a lot of them. Chinese officials have said as many as 1 million were imported between 90 and 94. Then in 94, China got caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing, smuggling full automatic weapons to South America using U.S. ports and some other hanky-panky. And so sanctions were put against China, banning the importation of all rifles, well, all firearms with a rifle barrel. This is why you can still find Chinese shotguns, but their rifles and pistols are gone. Unfortunate, but there it is. Now to the gun I first cheated with after the ban, Starting in 1993, two companies, PARS and Intric, would begin importing a version of the ARM out of Egypt, still made by the Maadi factory. This is one of those. They would come with a thumbhole stock originally. The bayonet lug is shaved off. The block is still here, just the wings are off. In the earlier guns, especially the Intrics, would have a muzzle cap welded on to cover up the threads, but if you broke the weld, you had a threaded barrel even with a pin underneath. Actually, on this one, when I got it, the cap was still on. All I had to do was take a pair of vice grips, not a padded vice grips, no less, and I just grabbed it and just twisted it, and it popped. The weld just popped right off. So it wasn't too much. But yeah, Intric and PARS would import several versions, one with a 16-inch barrel like this, and one with a 20. That would last for a couple of years until 95. Then Century Arms would take over in 97 with the MISR, the MISR. And then after the 98 ban on guns that could take high-capacity magazines, they would go to the MISR-10, which was a single-stack version of this. And then finally Century would do the MISR-SA, which was a fully converted version, much like the Romanian guns we're about to look at. It would have a pistol grip, they would have the opened up mag well, so on and so forth. But since this was during the federal assault weapons ban, which was more fun, passed in 1994, sunset in 2004, it forbade having evil features on all guns, period, no matter if they were import or domestically made. So when the MISRs were coming in the late 90s and early 2000s, they would not have been able to have a bayonet lug and threaded barrel anyway. Oh, and speaking of threaded barrel, after the first ones came in with the threads, the later MISRs would have the threads turned off at the factory, so it'll be a smaller diameter up here, so they would not have threaded barrels for long. After about 2001, political circumstances made getting more Egyptian guns into the country rather difficult. Now here is my trusty old SAR-1. This is Romanian. We didn't talk about this or any Romanian guns before because no Romanian guns came in the 80s. The very first Romanian guns hit our shores around 1997, and between then and 1999 they would go through a huge list of names and several importers. They would come in several different configurations. They would also be imported in 7.6239, 5.45 by 39, and even some in 5.56 223. They would sometimes have threaded barrels with caps welded over, but most of the times the threads would be cut off. They would usually have a square back receiver, but sometimes they would have a slant back. They were kind of getting the feel of things. Sometimes they were built from all new parts. Sometimes they were built from mismatched used parts. But in 1999, Century stepped in, kind of got things straightened out, and introduced the SAR-1 here, which is a ban-era gun imported from 99 until about 2002, 2003. This one's pretty much in stock configuration, except I added a Romanian G furniture set, and I had the barrel threaded just very recently. As these came in, they had barrels that were thankfully never threaded. The threads were not shaved off, so after the sunset of the assault weapons ban in 2004, you could thread the barrel if you wanted to. After the SAR, the WASR, which we all know today, started to come in 2003. And after the sunset of the assault weapons ban, they started to offer the WASR with a threaded barrel, bayonet lug, and sometimes a side folding or even underfolding buttstock. The WASR still comes in today, although the product line has kind of been curtailed a little bit. They used to have several different versions, but Century has kind of scaled back to more or less the basic WASR. They've done several other guns. We could do a whole video on Romanian imports. They've done an RPK as the AES-10B, They've done a version of the PM90 short rifles, the Draco. They've even done a version of their DMR in 7.62-54R as the PSL 54. But Romanian guns are still coming in today. They're one of the few still available, still fully imported. It's worth noting that between 90 and 94, the guns would have thumbhole stocks. Around 2000, you started to hear about this thing called 922R. Before that, you didn't really hear about it. But basically, it required manufacturers to install a set number of American parts to make the guns legal. Since the guns were technically banned in 1989, and then again in 1998, to get around that and make them technically U.S. made as opposed to foreign made and thus legal, they threw in a few parts. AKs require 5 parts, and if you have a removable muzzle device, they require 6. So during the ban, they would usually use a U.S. gas piston, U.S. pistol grip, and U.S. trigger group. That gave them 5. After the ban, they would simply use a U.S. Slant brake, and that gave them 6. Different importers have done different things, but that leaves the majority of the rifle, barrel, trunnions, receiver, even the handguard and buttstock as being original foreign made. Mitchell wouldn't give up on the Zastava guns either. They would introduce the M90 as a ban-compliant version. It would have a thumbhole stock. Obviously, even since the M70 didn't even have the grenade launcher or bayonet lug, it wouldn't have that either. It wouldn't have a threaded barrel, and it wouldn't have the flip-up night sights. A few more M90s came in than M70s, but then Civil War in Yugoslavia put pay to that, and then 94 with the assault weapons ban and other things. Basically, after the early 90s, Yugoslavian and later now Serbian guns would disappear for a brief, well, not brief, for quite about 10 years period at least. Then EAA would begin to import a highly sporterized version around, I don't recall right now, 2005, 2006 maybe, known as the PAP. It had a slant back receiver, it took low capacity mags, basically had no military features. They would import them for a while. They were pretty cheap, but they weren't really desirable because they didn't look much like a military AK. Thankfully, Century Arms got a hold of the product line around 2012 and began to sell the PAP M70, which was a square back gun like this that took high capacity mags and even had a threaded barrel. But they still lacked bayonet lug and grenade sights originally. The original PAP M70 would be on a 1.5 mil receiver. They would have some issues with it. Then they would introduce the NPAP, which would be on a 1.0 mil receiver. And eventually they would release this gun here, the OPAP, which was a return to the 1.5 mil receiver and original M70 B1 furniture. Now this one I've modified. I put the gas block with bayonet lug back on it, which is perfectly legal. Century Arms still imports and sells the NPAP today with both a fixed or an underfolding stock. They also do a pistol version of the Yugoslavian Krink, the Serbian Krink. The M92 is the M92 PV. It's definitely one of the better import lines today. Usually the US parts they use are trigger group and furniture, muzzle device. They are of good quality. They don't have a chrome line barrel, which bugs some people, but it is still cold hammer forged. And they are a true import. They're still assembled over in Serbia by Zastava. They have good military grade blued finish, polished bolt groups, all that stuff. The OPAPs haven't been available for quite some time, but even when they came in, Century told people they were going to be a limited run, so we're back to basically the NPAPs. Now moving on, We have probably the most famous importer, Arsenal. No Bulgarian guns came in during the 80s. The first ones, though, appeared very quickly after the fall of communism. They were known as the SA-93. They were a thumbhole stock version of a milled AK-47 Type 3, and they were very well made and very well received. They would be followed up by the SLR-95, which was a more modern version. It had polymer furniture and a polymer thumbhole stock. And of course, both of these would be band compliant, no threaded barrel, no bayonet lug, but they still would take high capacity magazines. There are several other versions, but after the 98 ban, the SLR-101 was introduced. It was a low cap milled receiver version that Arsenal Inc., Arsenal Inc. would import. And then they would start to do a conversion, and that was really the first conversion that Arsenal got into, was converting the SLR-101 to take high-capacity magazines and giving it a pistol grip and a fixed stock. Again, we're still during the federal assault weapons ban, so we can't add other fun things. So they would convert those using a mix of their own parts and Bulgarian parts, and they would be true imports. There would be a few other companies that early on imported Bulgarian guns. There was Global Trades, which did the SLR-100, and there was Arsenal USA, later Armory USA, which imported the SSR-85 and 86 series. So a few different guns came in from Bulgaria. Now, for a time, Arsenal was bringing over kits and 80% milled receivers and assembling guns here in the U.S. They were calling them the SA space M7 or SA space M5, which the M5 was in 5.56 NATO, the M7 was in 7.6239. But that got shut down in 2005. It was decided by the administration at that time and the Customs and Treasury and all that, that importing barrels with parts kits was no longer okay. So without being able to get barrels into the country, Arsenal quit assembling guns here and started to go back to importing guns. The first ones they imported, and I will revisit this one for a second, were in 2006 and will return to the SLR series. They would do stamped guns, as opposed to the milled they had been doing previously. They would originally do the SLR-107 in 7.6239, the SLR-106 in 5.56, and before that they had done a very small run of SLR-105s in 5.45, but these would have fixed stocks, whereas the 107 and 106 would have the side folding version. This. They would bring these over with thumbhole stocks and caps over the muzzle threads. Once they were here, they'd pop the caps off. They would weld back the bayonet lugs, because we're now finally out of the assault weapons ban, and they can do that. They would use a U.S. Arsenal made trigger group and pistol grip and some furniture components to get their 6 parts. By the way, a milled AK only needs 5 parts, or 4 if you don't have a removable muzzle device. And then finally they would do this version here, the SLR-104. They would introduce these in 2013, which is a return to the 5.45 by 39 caliber made in Bulgaria, and now we have a folding stock. This one I've modified a bit by adding the wood handguards, but they did offer them with the metal folding stock or the solid. Of course, this year, 2017, they just announced that no more 104s will be coming in for the foreseeable future, so we'll have to wait and see if that's Truth or Arsenal. That'd be a fun game, wouldn't it? Truth or Arsenal? I like the company, but sometimes their PR and their advertising can be a little zealous. Getting back to the SLR-101 series, it would disappear for 10 years, and they would reintroduce it in 2011. It would be a milled receiver gun converted from thumbhole stock to a fixed stock in the U.S. by Arsenal. And then they would change the name to SA-M7R, R standing for rail. because the SLR series, all of them are banned by name in California, and they wanted to sell in California, so they went back to the SAM designating, just taking out the space and the dashes. So they would do the SAM-7R. They would then introduce this gun here. This is the SAM-7SF for side folder. We have a side folding tubular stock. And we have a Galil style thumb safety. And we have 24 millimeter threaded barrel instead of 14 on the SLR 101 and SAM-7R. After this, they would also introduce an underfolding version known as the SAM-7UF for underfolding, and it would return to the 14 millimeter threads. These are built in Bulgaria. These are the first true milled receivers to come in since the Chinese guns, and they're very high quality. They also have a price tag. Although, to be fair, Arsenal's prices have been very stable, where everyone else's have been going up quite a bit in the last few years. So Arsenal guns, while still expensive, aren't as expensive as they once were, at least not compared to their competition. They're still importing this version here. As far as the SLR series, they're really only doing the SLR 107R, which is a fixed stock version of the SLR 107FR, which was a folder. That's coming in right now, and it's actually priced at $850 retail. And so it's kind of their entry into the more or less economy level AK market. Yeah, in 2017, $850 is considered a decent price on an AK versus, $250 years ago. But it is what it is. But the SLR 107FR and the SLR 104FR aren't coming in right now. We don't know when we'll see more, or even if we'll see more. The SLR 106FR was discontinued quite some time ago, but that was just because sales are pretty lousy. So Bulgarian guns are still coming in. Moving on. This is a Russian SGL 3194. Russian guns obviously did not come in during the assault, before the '89 ban. The Saigas, along with the Veprs, Saigas were made at Izhmash, and Veprs were made at Molot, started to appear in the mid-90s. When they were coming in, they were inexpensive, under $200 for the Saigas, and about $300, $350 for the Veprs. But they were completely sported versions. They took, lower capacity type mags. Restrictions with Russia have always been tight. In '94, there was a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Russia for Russia voluntarily not to export military-type guns here. So since '94, they haven't sent things like Makarov pistols over, SKS rifles, even SVT-40s. They have started to send, of course, then, very highly sporterized AK-type guns, Saigas and Veprs. The Saigas would have a Monte Carlo-type stock. They would not take high-cap mags. The Veprs would be sold with a more military-type stock and grip, and some of them could take higher capacity mags. So the Veprs always walked the line a little closer. The Veprs were imported in small numbers by Robinson Arms, in the 90s and early 2000s. The Saigas would go through several importers, including EAA and RAA, but really no one did much with them. There wasn't a big conversion market. For one thing, they came in at first during the assault weapons ban, so you couldn't do a lot anyway. But even after the ban was lifted, people started to convert them, but not a lot. It wasn't a big deal. Again, it wasn't until Arsenal stepped in 2008, they started to import the SGL, first 10, then 20, then 21, all of them in 7.62-39, and then finally the SGL 31 here. They would first have folding stocks, and later they would use the original Russian side folder. Again, these would come in with thumbhole stocks. They would convert them, give them military features, And this was legal since once they threw in 6 U.S. parts, they were magically U.S. made, not Russian made. So it didn't impact that bilateral agreement or the 89 ban or the 98 ban. It's legal rigmarole. They would be very successful. At one time, the SGL converted guns would get as low as $500. That was around 2009, 2010. And they would climb back up. Unfortunately, good things don't last. 2014, the Russian company of Kalashnikov concern, which owns Izhevsk, was sanctioned due to Russia's activities in the Crimea and other things. So American companies were prohibited from doing business. At the same time, importers like Arsenal thought, okay, well, I should back up. Arsenal changed its Russian import company to FIME Group around 2013. Anyway, Arsenal, FIME, same thing. They would switch over to the Molot line, the Vepr, which had been imported on and off by several different people over the years, including IO, Wolf, but nothing again really stuck. It took Arsenal's big attitude and money to really make it go. They started to sell converted Veprs with pistol grip, taking high cap mags, threaded barrels last year. And then this year, 2017, June, the Russian company of Molot was added to the list because it was claimed they had a connection to Kalashnikov concern. So we had about 3 years of Veprs to come in after the Saigas, and now both models and both companies are put on the sanctions list. So today, there is no way to get a Russian rifle into the USA. It was good while it lasted. I'll be honest, when they first started to come in, I couldn't believe it. Russian guns were always kind of a dream for those of us in the 80s and 90s, but it was good while it lasted. If you find a Russian gun for a good price, it's probably not a bad idea to pick it up. And finally, another good while it lasted was the Polish Archer 01, made by Radom. Well, okay, Fabryki Bruni in the town of Radom, before someone corrects me. I know, but we all call it Radom, the same as Cougar in Romania. Before this, no real Polish AKs came in. This is a version of the WZ-96 Beryl in 5.56 NATO 223, currently issued by the Polish military. They started to bring these in 2012, 2013. They were extremely well made, and they have some great features. We have a full video on this, so I'm not going to harp on it here. If you're interested, check our video out for a long history of this one's import. But when these came in, they were overpriced for what they were, and IO wasn't shipping them with all of their accessories. Long story short, they didn't sell well. Finally, around 2014, IO dropped the price and they started to sell better, but then they stopped importing them. They announced in early 2015 they were bringing no more in. And after the dust settled, we all realized that fewer than 700 of these came in. That's fewer than the number of M62 Valmets. So they're a very nice gun. To date, the only true Polish FB Radom built gun to be imported, and they have typical Polish quality, and they're priced about like an Arsenal. But it's one of my favorite guns. It's also about the most modern AK I own. But it's neat, and I really hope someone eventually imports these. I really think Arsenal should, or FIME. You know, they've had bad luck with Molot, and before that, Izhevsk out of Russia. They should really try to partner up with Radom. They seem very eager to send guns over here, and they just can't find a good partner. They tried IO, which didn't work out because it's IO, and they tried Radom USA, which it didn't work out for several other reasons. Check out our video. So that is, in a nutshell, the history of imported AKs, from the earliest ones in the late 60s to the newest ones that are still coming in today and were recently prohibited from coming in. We basically have three styles, three generations. We have the original unmolested guns that just came in. We have the post-89 guns, which came in as thumbhole stocks. And those really kind of get separated out into pre-98 and post-98, because before 98 the thumbhole stocks could take high cap mags. After 98 they were not able to. But thankfully US companies got smart around 99 and realized they could convert them with a few parts and make them US compliant. So I guess if you want, there's 4 types, although I consider kind of the middle two to be basically the same, just different magwell. While preban guns are nice, they really are, honest to God, newer guns that came in are just as nice. They're still built in the same overseas factories that have been building Kalashnikovs for 50 years in some cases, even longer. They just have to have a few US parts tossed in, such as trigger group, which, you know, theoretically would be very easy to take back out. At the very most, some of them have to have their magwells opened up. Now, ones like the Russian guns actually, and the Bulgarians, actually don't come with single stack magwells. What they come in with is no bullet guide, so all Arsenal has to do is rivet in a bullet guide in some cases. This is definitely true with the Vepr FMs. So there are ways around, and while, yeah, obviously we'd all love to have only pre-ban imports, I consider the newer imports to be really just as good because they're still built over in the same factories. They're definitely worth checking out. And also, if you'd like to see our video comparing an import, a modern day import, to a US made gun, check that out please. And I know I kind of just went over this in a hurry, so we have a blog that goes more into a timeline with more model names and definitions. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, please post them below. Love to hear your stories or your thoughts on imported AKs and the history of them. If you liked the video, please click like. If you haven't already subscribed, we'd really appreciate it if you could sometime. As always, this is Misha, and please tune in again next time for more, hopefully, interesting videos.